Hello, let's talk about if statements in this video. One of our selection constructs, so one of the ways we can implement selection in a programming language. So an if statement begins with a Boolean condition. A condition is used to decide whether some code should run or not. It's how we make our decision in our program. So if this condition turns out to be true, it's either going to be true or false, then the code within the if statement will run. So the code inside it only runs if it's true. If it's false, it doesn't run. So here is a simple program where we've got an if statement in the middle. First thing we're doing is asking the user how much money is in your account. This is then getting converted to be an integer and saved as a variable called money. Then we're checking to see if money is greater than $1 million. If it is, then we're going to print, wow, you're a millionaire. If it wasn't bigger than $1 million, which sadly is the case for most of us, it will just skip this if statement. So the code inside this print line only runs if the condition is true. If it's false, it skips it. Now I've deliberately put a print line right at the bottom here. This print line runs no matter what. Because this print line is outside of our if statement, it runs whether this was true or false. It runs anyway. So this print line has got a gap at the start of the line. This gap is called the indentation. And this code here is actually OCR exam reference language, where actually indentation doesn't matter. So I could have not indented it at all. I could have put the print right on the left-hand side. I can do that because of then and endif. Then and endif mean that it doesn't need to be indented because it knows when the if statement is finished. Whereas in a language like Python, we have got to indent code inside the if statement because in Python, we don't have endif, we just dedent it. So unindenting it symbolizes we have ended our if statement. In OCR era, we don't have to do this, but you still should because it looks a lot clearer. It's really clear that print is inside this if statement. So you should indent no matter what, especially if you're writing Python code, because as a reminder, if you know how to do this in Python, that's great. Just write Python code in the exam, but you must indent it. I must say, indentation is often the first thing which goes when students start answering questions. You need to be right up against your margin for all of these lines, apart from anything which goes inside the if statement. Now here is an if statement at its most primitive form. You can also add on a few other what are called clauses to this as well. A clause is an optional part of an if statement. So elseif is one of these. An elseif covers what you might consider a secondary condition. If is our primary condition. Elseif covers sort of backup conditions, things we want to check after we check the if. So elseifs are only checked if previous ones were false. I've been quite vague there because this covers both previous elseifs and the if itself, because we always need to start with an if. But if I've got other things I want to check as well, as part of this same if statement, I need to add elseifs. Here, I've added 2 elseifs. I still always end if right at the bottom because this is one big if statement. Now, I'm sorry to remind you of exams, but this example, we're asking the user for a score and we are categorizing it, we're grading it based on this score. So one thing to point out is all 3 of them won't necessarily get checked. Let's say my score is great and I get 90. Well, if score is greater than 85, 90 is greater than 85. So therefore this is true. Therefore the code inside this part runs. So we get grade A outputted on the screen. And if you read the definition again, elseifs are only checked if previous ones were false. So because this was true, these won't get looked at all. They don't even get looked at. They get skipped. If I scored maybe, let's say 81, well, if score is greater than 85, well, that's not true anymore. So I don't run this code here. I skip to the elseif, the first elseif at least. But 81 is bigger than 70. So therefore this one does run and we print out grade B to the user. The bottom elseif gets skipped because the previous one was true. This time round, let's say I did less well and got maybe 42. 42 isn't bigger than 85, so that's false. 42 isn't bigger than 70, so that's false. And 42 is not bigger than 50, so that's also false. So it checks them one by one sequentially. Unfortunately here, I've reached the end of my if statement and none of these were true, so therefore no code runs at all here. Now we do need to keep this idea in our head because sometimes people think that elseifs are just optional. They can just use ifs instead. And you can if you're clever, but here is an example where somebody hasn't been very clever. They've used 3 ifs instead of 1 if and 2 elseifs. Here, if I get a high score of say 95, well 95 is bigger than 85, so that's true. and we print grade A, which is kind of what I want. However, because ifs always get checked, here score is bigger than 70. So that's also true. 95 is bigger than 70. So grade B gets printed as well. And now 95 is also bigger than 50. So that's also true. And so it also prints grade C as well, which is not what I want. I don't want all three to get printed. I only wanted one to get printed, which is why I should have used elseif. And if you want to be really fancy, we should use elseif when it is a mutually exclusive situation where only one of these conditions should be true. That is when we should use elseif. Like elseif, which is called elif in Python, we can have an optional clause called else as well. So else has got no condition and only runs if no previous conditions were met, whether it's if, whether it's elseif. So it's there to cover all other possibilities. We can't account for every other possibility, but we can use else to cover for anything which we haven't covered in our previous conditions. So here I'm asking you to enter a language. I've got a fairly feeble attempt to cover 3 languages where I say welcome in that language. English, German, Danish are covered. Clearly, not every language is included here. I cannot account for every single language the user might type in because they might type in gibberish. So instead of trying to do that, I'm using else, which covers every other possibility. Let's say I typed in German when asked. Well, this first if statement isn't true, it doesn't run, but the next else if is true, so this code will run, and the bottom else if and the bottom else get skipped because they only run if previous ones were false. But if I typed in Russian, well, it would check the first if statement, that's not true. It would check the second else if, well, the second condition, that's not true. It would then check the next else if, that's not true. And then finally, because all of those were false, our else does run and it would say language not recognized. So else only runs if all the previous ones were false. That's why else must come right at the end.